the system to load up. Okay, well, let's get started. Thank you very much for joining us for this this webinar, whose title is either utterly ingenious or utterly appalling, and we still can't work out which is Refreshing Beveridge, the Welfare State at 80. As I think most people know, it's now 80 years since the Beveridge report was published and set the framework for what is now the welfare state. But as we all know, the welfare state is facing significant challenges at the moment, but we are delighted to be joined by a genuine policy supergroup to discuss this. Of course, we have Guy Opperman, who is the Minister for Work and Pensions. We have Helen Barnard, who is the Research and Policy Director at Pro Bono Economics and author of one of 5 books published by Agenda Publishing on the Beveridge report, and her one is called Want. Which goes into what current situation looks like. We have Jonathan Dupont, who co-authored a brilliant CPS report called Fair Welfare, which argued that we have actually lost touch with Beveridge's original ideas of contribution and individual merits, and need to, if the welfare system wants to command public support, we need to reintroduce that element to the welfare state. And we have Duncan Robinson, who is the budget columnist at The Economist and author of a brilliant column recently called, which was about the night watchman state, which was arguing that essentially we were left with a kind of, we've somehow managed to create a very expensive but very ramshackle state, which doesn't actually do many of the things that we might want it to. So each of the panelists is going to say a few words to start. We'll try and keep that as quick as possible and have a quick discussion, and then move on to questions. And if there's a Q&A box, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with by now, so please put your questions in there, and we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. But Guy, let's start with you. The welfare state at 80.
So thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and it is an honour also to have an opportunity to talk about Beveridge, who is buried in my constituency in Prockrington, a small country churchyard in Northumberland, and genuinely people go on pilgrimages to come and see his burial site on the Northumberland moors in a deserted church. And it is something that is of great importance today to discuss where we are with the welfare state, whether there is a continuing strand that runs through the original reforms to where we are right now. I'd make a couple of very quick points. The first is, I came into Parliament in 2010, and there has been effectively 2 phases of reform post the 2010 and the 2015 general elections, and the introduction of universal credit and the complete wholesale reform of welfare in this country. You then had the interregnum that was COVID. And one of the few benefits of COVID is that it utterly put to bed any argument that universal credit wasn't the right solution for a modern welfare system in 21st century Britain, because there is no prospect of the legacy system having coped with COVID and all the difficulties and disasters that we had to deal with. We now are in a situation post-COVID of what do we do and how do we continue to improve and enhance universal credit. I'm the minister that has got to take that forward. I'd make a couple of quick points on that. The first is we need to roll out universal credit on a long-term basis to all the different cohorts. It isn't dealing with all cohorts as yet. That is a work in progress. Secondly, we need to do much greater work on what is called in-work progression. And there is a lot of money and a lot of effort going into that to ensure that those who are on universal credit and who are working are progressing to bigger and better paid jobs and are effectively coming off benefit on a longer term basis. But I listen, my main reason to be here is to listen. I'm in an august and stellar group at a great think tank who has some great ideas. I look forward to listening and learning and discussing and debating how we can take forward universal credit and also welfare in this country in the brave new world that we now live in.
Well, I'll ask Helen to be the first to respond. And I should also, by the way, credit Helen for having the idea for this event in the first place. So thank you very much for that. Helen.
It was brilliant to see you all here, and great opening remarks from Guy, really interesting. So I think I'd just say probably two things about Beveridge and where we're at. I think one is that the Beveridge settlement has proved remarkably resilient, I think, against all expectations. And I think, as Guy said, we've seen some really great successes. I mean, I always think one of the biggest successes for our modern state is the more than halving of pensioner poverty, and that shift over a period of several decades from older age being a time of fear and hardship for many, many people, to actually now pensioners having the lowest poverty rates of any group. And I think we should be proud of that as a nation. But I also think that the challenges that Beveridge was trying to solve have changed massively, and our institutions haven't caught up with that. So, the most obvious one is around employment. Unemployment is no longer really the big issue we're facing. What we need is much better work on the employer side as well as from the state to open up jobs for people who are juggling health conditions and caring, which is a bigger and bigger proportion of the workforce. And at the moment, it feels like we still have an approach which is tailored to unemployment and getting people kind of quickly into jobs when they don't have any of those considerations. And we need to modernise that. And similarly, health service is one of the most obvious ones. The health service was set up to basically do mass immunisation, so millions of workers in cities didn't spread disease, and fix broken legs and things from industrial accidents. It was never designed to deal with long-term chronic conditions, which is what it now needs to cope with, and it just doesn't do a very good job. So I think there is a very clear case for updating the settlement. I think the last thing I would say is one of the things that Beveridge talked about, which I think is not often discussed, is the idea he talked about there being a national minimum. So the idea there was a kind of publicly agreed level at which, if you were going to be eligible through contribution or any other reason, there should be a minimum level of support you get. And I think we have lost that along the way, and that's partly why we're seeing such high levels of food insecurity and so on. But I think the solution has to be to actually create this with public involvement and with the involvement of people who are on the system. And I think that we have not been very good nationally at doing either of those things. And a lot of the problems we've seen stem from not involving the public in decisions about their money and not involving the people who are going to be on the system with designing it to make it work. I think rectifying that would give us a really good basis for a system that could last the next 80 years. I will also stop there because I'm keen to hear what everyone else has to say in the audience.
We're going to be done by past at this rate. Duncan, over to you.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. So my take on the sort of welfare state as we are now is that we've basically ended up with a sort of night watchman welfare state. So we've currently got the sort of the worst of two worlds. So we promise a big, well-funded 20th century welfare state, but we actually deliver something more akin to a night watchman state, which sort of steps in only the last moment, which is also the sort of most expensive moment to step in. And so if you think about your day-to-day interactions with the welfare state, so if you'll be kept alive if you're hit by a car, but it's very difficult to book a GP appointment. Universal credit will, keep you off the breadline, but it's not really enough to sort of live and thrive on. It's not especially generous. And for people in the middle, if wage growth stays strong in London, for example, you could easily imagine, but towards the end of the decade, the median salary in the capital will be about £50,000, because that's what happens with inflation and relatively strong bargaining powers. But that's the point at which you start losing child benefits, and that was meant to be something that only high-income people lost. But instead, we're ending up with a situation where people in pretty median average circumstances are losing out. So it doesn't strike me as a particularly universal system in which everyone pays in, but everyone gets something out. And so you don't really get much from a European perspective. It's a sort of cradle or grave rather than a sort of cradle to grave system. And the kicker within that is that it's not even particularly cheap anymore. We like to sort of kid ourselves that the British state is sort of very small and nippy, and so we get a bit less than people in the Netherlands, but we pay a lot less. But that's not quite true anymore. So the state's sort of expanding. So it'll be by 2025, it's going to be about the tax take is going to be about 37% of GDP. Now in the Netherlands, it's at around 39-40% of GDP, but they get a heck of a lot more for that money that they spend. And so we're at about sort of 90 to 95% of the cost of the Dutch state, but we often sort of get literally half as much. So an example would be out of work benefits. So in the Netherlands, that sort of kicks in, and it's around sort of 75% of the salary for the first few months, and then it drips down to the lower, but still potentially lower, but still very high level of about 1,200 euros a month, which is really rather high. And so you might think, but a Dutch guy will sort of end up paying a lot more in tax. But again, that's not really the case. I was just playing around with the tax calculator before it came on. If someone earning the equivalent of £34,000 pays about a quarter of their income to the state in the UK, and it's exactly the same in the Netherlands, but they get so much more. And so I've been thinking about the sort of reasons about why we have this state that promises a lot but sort of doesn't always deliver. And my hunch is that there's a lot of false economies going on, and they do have a tendency to cascade through the system. And so there is this sort of emphasis that there's always, for political reasons, there's always been this sort of effort to protect the NHS, to protect the NHS budget, but that has come at the cost of other departments who've had a much tougher time. And so just you end up with the hypothetical situation where imagine if some of that money had just been sort of pumped into social care. Imagine if you didn't have to have, police spending their time dealing with mental health cases that might have been dealt with by local councils or local authorities back in the day. And even just sort of a very small amount of money for the NHS, say a couple of billion, could absolutely transform the justice system in the UK. We have this sort of peculiar misallocation of resources in Britain. And so we end up fixing problems in the sort of most expensive way possible. So my relatively optimistic hope is that if you can remove these false economies, if you can spend a little bit more money, so only a tiny gap between the British state and the Dutch state, I think you would get a much better and more efficient state at the end of it.
Okay, well, obviously, CPS panel, we're very against spending more money in any way, but Jonathan, your take on it.
Thanks, Rob. So I guess when I think of the Beveridge report, I kind of think of four things. So one, that it was kind of this unification of lots of stuff that already existed. It was kind of the universal credit of its day, tidying stuff up. Two, that it kind of got rid of a lot of means tests, which were the thing then that was seen as widely unfair. They were kind of the sanctions then, they were seen as intrusive and unfair. Third, that people should have to contribute, that it should be, a lot of welfare should be done on a flat rate, both in what you pay in and what you pay out, rather than just for income, again, the means test. And then fourthly, the state should only provide a minimum, leaving some space for people to top up. And obviously, some of that worked well, and some of it proved not to work so well. Defining what counts as a minimum is really hard. We're still arguing about poverty lines. We haven't really got past the trade-off between means testing and keeping stuff affordable and making sure people still have incentive to earn more. And as Beveridge himself stressed, the five giants, you can't really divorce from the wider economy. Today, we'd probably also want to talk about housing and energy costs when you're looking at poverty and unemployment. But I think some of those 2 big points, that kind of welfare has to be seen as fair, and that it should still leave room for people to top up, it shouldn't be trying to do everything, have kind of stood the test of time. So as Rob said, we did a project for the CPS that got published last year, where we looked a lot at kind of this issue of what the public thought was fair, what they liked about the welfare system, what they thought still needed to be made fairer. And kind of the headline finding of that was only 20% would say the welfare system is fair at the moment. We then dug into that quite a bit. And it wasn't so much that people thought individual benefits were too generous. On balance, people actually said they were maybe too low. That figure kind of goes up and down over time. But at the moment, I think people don't think they're too generous. The concerns were more about who was claiming and what they had to do to get it back. It's that contribution point from Beveridge. So we saw people still strongly felt that the benefit system should do more to encourage people to find work. 50% said people should have to do more, versus 11% who said it should do too much. I mean, a majority actually even supported kind of a workfare sort of thing, where you'd have to do part-time job if you're claiming benefits. And similarly, there's this story that's gone around kind of the policy think tank world for ages, that people overestimate the level of fraud in the welfare system. And I think that is true to some extent. It definitely is true if you kind of measure it against the kind of DWP statistics and what the level of fraud is. But I think it's also true people have a kind of a bigger, more moralized sense of fraud. They really feel that you should be doing everything you can to find a job. And if you're not, then you're kind of free riding on the system. And similarly, another type of fairness is that people thought they shouldn't be penalised for having done the right thing beforehand. People thought it was very unfair that you got paid less if you had some kind of savings buffer saved up. So I think where do we go from here? I think two things of kind of Beveridge kind of philosophy I think is still relevant. One, there's a lot of pressure to implement a universal basic income or something like that. ChatGPT is going to replace all our jobs. And I get the appeal from a pure simplicity point of view, but I think if you talk to the public, they still really value sense of reciprocity, fairness. There has to kind of be a moral element to the welfare system too. And then two, I think, especially in the centre right, actually, I think we kind of lost sight of this idea of helping people top up beyond the minimum. As Duncan says, if you're kind of a middle-class worker, JSA doesn't really act as kind of insurance for you if you lose your job. But we do basically nothing to help people put aside money for themselves. Auto-enrollment works really well in pensions. I feel there's lots more things we could be doing like that to help people save more money on the side and for self-employment and people like that. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. An awful lot of things to go out there, and I think it's interesting that some of these things, quite a lot of these things are effectively in tension. I mean, one of the things, John, Helen talked about underemployment versus unemployment, which is completely right. But one of the issues, and we've advocated in our work at CPS raising the taper rate so that people get to keep more money as they expand their hours. But then, if you take that to its logical extent and say, e.g., you should always keep more than half of everything extra you earn, you end up with families on 50 or 60,000 still getting universal credit, which kind of doesn't feel like a benefit system anymore. I think there is a lot of tensions here. So I'm going to, start with a sort of slightly provocative question. Is it time we stopped talking about Beveridge? It was a great report, but is framing everything that we do on welfare policy now as a kind of judging basically, having little bracelets like what would Clement Attlee think? Does that kind of constrict us and prevent us from actually facing up to the challenges of a modern state, and and of where we are now? Is it time for like a new, for someone to go away and write, the Barnard report, for example, just to.
Well, I'll dive in and answer that. The answer is yes, in my view. Everything should have a framework, and Beveridge is clearly a framework around which the welfare state, health service, the expansion of state pension was created, and no one should dispute that. And it is a bit like talking about your heritage. Who your grandparents were 80 years ago doesn't define who you are right now. What was done post-war or pre-war and then was done by everyone from Churchill to Bevin to Attlee and successive generations of prime ministers and governments doesn't define what 21st century pensions look like, doesn't define what 21st century healthcare looks like, doesn't define what 21st century welfare reform looks like. Those three things clearly have got to be looked at in the lens of a very, very different economy. Longevity has quite clearly gone through the roof, which is a wonderful thing, but has a massive impact on state spending, particularly in terms of pension contributions and pension spend by the state. Similarly with healthcare. My short answer is, it of course frames the debate. It of course is relevant, but is frankly an irrelevancy going forward in terms of how it is we approach the three key things that we've been discussing today.
Don't wait for me, guys. Just come in on.
So I think there are two things that are useful about Beveridge these days. One is just having a historical jumping off point. It lets you make the contrast. It lets us say things have changed. Here's what's changed, and I think that's useful. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about this whole Beveridge anniversary, though, is people keep talking about it as if it was a single Big Bang moment that suddenly set everything up. And actually, I think what is the useful part of thinking about it is partly that it was the culmination of about 2 decades of experimentation, essentially, of social experiments across the country, people trying stuff out, which it then became a conduit to say, let's pull this together into something bigger and more national. I also think, I did history back in many years ago, and I always find it slightly reassuring to know that whatever's happening now has happened has always happened before. It's like when you're a parent of a toddler, your second child, you do know they'll eventually sleep, and that is really helpful. I think in terms of what we're talking about, one of the things I looked at in the book was the historian Carlota Perez, who looks at the interaction between technological change and economic and social change. And I find it really useful that her framing was that every time you have a major technological breakthrough in history, you then have a period of crisis and you have specific phases. So you get excitement, recession, inequality widens, you get social unrest, the rise of populist leaders, and then new social norms emerge and new social institutions emerge fit for the state. So that's what was happening with the industrial era. That's what Beveridge essentially was part of. I think we're in another 20s and 30s because we've got the technological changes of the digital era, the low carbon era, and we're in that phase of social unrest, of short-lived governments, of populism and inequality. But we will emerge into the 40s with new social norms, and that's what we need to build now.
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of both those points. I think first off, obviously, Beveridge, normal people have no idea what it is. They might have learned it at GCSE, but they forget it shortly afterwards. And even in the Westminster bubble, I feel it's mostly shorthand for we're going to do an event on welfare policy, and it means a very different thing if you're in the left wing or you're on the right wing. I have written lots of pamphlets over the years on what is Beveridge now? What is Beveridge now? I think I still remember Beveridge at 70, actually. But I think more substantively, I think this isn't really, as Helen was saying, Beveridge report came after a lot of things for the tidy up exercise. And I feel we are now not at the tidy up exercise. I feel we just had a big reform of universal credit. And we need to iterate and experiment and build on that rather than trying to blow everything up and start from scratch again at this point.
Duncan, do you want to come in, or I can move on?
No, it's just echoing Helen's point about the report not being a sort of big bang moment. It wasn't like one weird trick to fix welfare in the UK. It was the culmination of almost 50 years. The other thing that Beveridge is sort of slightly useful, it points out that every single party does have a stake in the welfare state. He was a Liberal. He launched it under a Conservative Prime Minister and was put into action under a Labour one. Like, it is a relatively universal political project as well. So that's still quite healthy. Although I agree with everything else that it's probably not as useful as it was.
But Rob, doesn't it have to be also subdefined into the different elements of this? So you could look at
what's disease, ignorance, follow, and idleness.
Well, no, I wouldn't go down that particular route. I would go down a three-stage route, which is fundamentally in relation to welfare of itself. And the major reform is obviously universal credit, but there are other parts of welfare reform that you can discuss. The second is the health service, which again is utterly key to this country and has been generated out of Beveridge and other reforms that were being talked about. And the third is the expansion and support through state pension credit, and other elements of older person support. Now, you look at those three key elements, which are the three large levers to try and address what Beveridge rightly identified. And all of those things fundamentally go to how you look at those particular points. You can then talk about employment and pay, and I'm a massive opponent of universal basic income. It doesn't work, and the evidence is overwhelming on that, but that's a separate issue. But my point would surely be is look at those three policy areas and ask yourself, is the state, whether you like or dislike this particular state, in a process of reform of the way in which those three policy areas are being implemented on an ongoing basis in 2022? And my view would be that universal credit is a work in progress. That's the first thing. Which clearly, can it be improved? Is there things that we can do to expand it? Have we finished it? Quite frankly, the answer is no. And yes, we can improve it, obviously. But the principle, no one is going to get rid of universal credit. All political parties now are signed up to a modern welfare system that is run in this basis. There is then arguments about, obviously, taper rates and things like that. But that principle, in my view, is established. In fact, other countries want to copy us. Similarly, in terms of pension reforms, following Turner, you have a pension reform system that I spent 5 years working in, which is fundamentally a state pension as a catch-all pension credit for those who were particularly in hardship, and a private pension system expanding on an ongoing basis post-Turner. And then you have a health service, and I think that is the area where potentially there is an area for radical and more serious reform on a long-term basis, where the ever enhancing budget. I mean, DWP budget's gone up from 151 billion to 245 billion in the last 10 years. Health service budget has gone through the roof at the same time. The ever enhancing budget, how are you then going to spend it? What does healthcare look like in the 21st century going forward?
And I think that's actually going to be my next question, and ties into what Duncan was saying about how, you know, the NHS kind of is this, because it is the thing, and it's kind of, you know, we focus so much on it. And so for my Sunday Times column this weekend, which I'm sure all of you watching have read, but I will recap for the few who haven't. I wrote about NHS reform, and I played hopefully a clever trick, which is that the entire I wrote, you know, about how the NHS was too decentralised, and I actually argued that there was a very legitimate case that back in 1945 we made a wrong turn, that everyone else in Europe was building a national system on top of existing provision of, you know, so having a kind of, basically it didn't matter who you got your care from, but, you know, it would all be part of the same system, whether it was faith groups, community groups, not-for-profit, the state, local government, you know, for-profit services. And we sort of almost uniquely went down this sort of nationalised monopoly route. And then, of course, at the end, I revealed that that this was in fact not my own view, but the collective view of Tony Blair and his health secretaries, culled from about 40,000 words of their speeches, with me just taking out the bits about how our progressive values will ensure that we always stay true to Beveridge's original vision. It feels like, partly because of the Lansing reforms, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of Danny Boyle's Olympic opening ceremony, the NHS has become the sort of untouchable bit, and the bit where you can't really talk about whether you know, the whole idea of like top down NHS reform has become in itself politically toxic. So how do we fix that element of it that the guys identified and Duncan's identified? Guy may want to stay quiet on this for fear of...
Well, I'm not. I'll make one comment. Which clearly I'm not the health secretary. I don't speak on behalf of the government in terms of NHS reform. But what I would say is this: is that I found the approach of Wes Streeting over the weekend remarkable, because you had a Labour Shadow Secretary of State basically having a proper go at the BMA, and basically arguing that the BMA were holding back reform and modernisation of the health service. Now, he then slightly has rode back on that, and I get there's a lot of politics if you're a Labour frontbencher in the middle of some conflict to take what is clearly a very Blairite view. And, you know, competition was introduced effectively into the NHS under the Competition Act under Tony Blair. My take on it was, though, that there is an appetite under Labour that is genuinely there, and you speak to them privately, they will say this, for reform of the NHS on an ongoing basis. Now, that's a very big step forward that has not existed in the last 15 to 17 years. You know, throughout, basically post about 2005-6, the Labour Party have abandoned any concept of reform of the NHS. The very fact that we're now beginning to have that sort of conversation, and as always, there is some politics and some complications as to what that looks like. But the very fact that the Labour Shadow Secretary of State is going down that route, I found very, very significant.
I mean, the other thing I would say is I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that the NHS is a solution to health. And actually, of course, we know that it's something like 4/5 of the drivers of our health have nothing to do with healthcare and everything to do with the rest of our lives. And it, you know, in particular, having a healthy home, you know, people living in a home that they can afford and is warm and healthy, people doing work that is predictable and rewarding, and, you know, there's all these things in your life that will make or break your health. And I think that I think you're right, the kind of that sense of the NHS as a religion has become conflated with the idea that for most people your health is the biggest determiner of whether your life is okay or not. And I think we need to kind of pull back and think about what else can we do that will reduce the burden on the health service and also improve people's health. And I think there is something about public services about doing much more decentralisation down to local levels and much more focus on prevention rather than just fixing crises. And that's been a trend in the last decade or so. You can see it with children's services, that the funding for children's services has just become concentrated in crisis services as the funding reduced. And the preventative side has just been starved of funds, and therefore more families enter crisis. And that's bad for everybody, both families and the taxpayer.
No, I'd completely agree with that point. I think if you just fix the best way to fix the NHS would be to sort of forget about it and just focus on the rest of the state, because it just takes up so much political and fiscal bandwidth. So if you could just ignore it for a little bit, it would be in a much better state. But there are specific things you could do with NHS, because when people do discuss reforms, it either gets framed in more money, which is this very sort of 1990s debate, because it did used to be the NHS was just incredibly underfunded compared to European rivals, but the advantage was it was incredibly cheap, and the outcomes, they were worse, but they were sort of okay, not great, but they were okay. Now in a situation where it's costs roughly the same as a normal European health system, but the outcomes are still worse, which is not a very good situation to be in. And I think another point to make would be that it is fundamentally undermanaged. There is always this sort of focus on, NHS managers or press officers, when the problem, I'd argue, is the direct opposite. Like the NHS spends, frankly, too little money on management. And so I've got a friend who's a surgeon, and he spends a lot of his time sort of compiling voters. And I simply refuse to believe that is the best use of his time.
So I guess I would just say, after saying the last question, saying we should shut up about Beveridge, that if you're going to do a meme of Beveridge report, I think it would be about what you did about health. It's obviously the big long-term story of growing health spending, how you stop that crowding out everything else. And things, I think people are starting to talk about it. I mean, everyone's just been about the supply side, but on the demand side, how you ensure minimum without discouraging people. Are actually starting to talk, should we actually be encouraging people to opt out if they can? Which was incredibly toxic 10 years ago. I don't know if it will still be toxic in 5 years. I'm not sure if that helps, but it might help on the edges. But yes, I think figuring out how you get incentives for people to take responsibility for their health as well, I think has to be part of the story in the long term, or else we're going to swinging nothing on back the NHS and a bit of schooling in 20 years.
So can I come in with two policy suggestions, which I hesitate to do so, but not least because I quite like the Centre for Policy Studies to assist me driving them forward, and or the great and the good who are on the call here. So there are two, which is, I think, where Beveridge is helpful is, what are your solutions to the 5 things that Beveridge raises? Now, I think the point is fairly made that a blanket NHS is the panacea to everything is simply not the case. It is, the NHS is amazing, but it is not the panacea to all aspects Beveridge raises, and it is not the panacea in 2022 to all particular difficulties. I'd give 2 things. The first would be this. There is clearly, in my job, I am seeing a difficulty retaining workforce in employment. Partly because there are care issues, partly because some people want to retire, partly because of COVID. There are a whole host of issues. But at the same stage, there is some good evidence, particularly from American companies, where employers step in and provide a greater degree of support to their employees. Now, the obvious example is flexible working, as opposed to 9 to 5 fixed-term contracts. The obvious example is care support in terms of the ability to be flexible around your caring responsibilities. The obvious example is obviously childcare reforms that have been brought into this country and other countries. But there's a bit more there, which is something that I'm curious to see whether the panel is interested in, is imagine you are employed by a large company, harder with a small company, I accept, but that large company then takes on responsibility for various of your either personal ailments or your ability to manage your lifestyle, such that without that, you would then resign and or go and work for somebody else. There are a lot of employers who are looking at this on an ongoing basis. How you then make that larger and make it a thing, and then give them potentially a tax break to incentivize them to do more on that, clearly is more complicated, but it's not impossible. Other countries are looking at this. But I do feel there's a role for basically an employer to address some of the ongoing management of our day-to-day difficulties. The second is, and Rob has heard me talk about this, which is the midlife MAT. I think it is the best policy suggestion for a very long period of time for those between the ages of 45 and 55. You look at your wealth, your work, and your well-being, and employers, the evidence from the Aviva report is overwhelming that if you do this, people would stay in work, would be healthier, and would earn more, and also have more in retirement. Now, that's a pretty major intervention for relatively low cost to the employer. And of course, the state has almost no involvement whatsoever. So I think one of the finesses of the way ahead post-Beveridge is, how does the state provide the catch-all coverage, as Duncan and others have talked about in the nature of the National Health Service, but how do we have interventions that are appropriate to our particular needs and wants as an ongoing basis? Now, that is something that I do think there is a way ahead on.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry. I mean, I'd love to get to this, but we probably need to move to questions. So can we just park that for a second, especially because normally we don't allow. Normally we just have I read out the questions, but I can see that we've got Vernon Bogdanor raising his hand. Who I'm hoping if I click allow to talk, will be able to ask his question, and hopefully this is the real Vernon Bogdanor. Otherwise, someone is engaged in a very highbrow prank. But yes. So, Vernon.
Well, my points aren't highbrow. I read your article and agreed with it 100%, and I wrote a similar article in the Daily Telegraph, which I suspect no one read, but it suggested that a preliminary to reform would be a proper evaluation of continental health systems, which a Conservative government hardly dare institute because it would be accused of privatizing the system. And therefore, this should be done by a think tank, such possibly as CPS, which would establish such a commission of people working full-time for a year and then reporting on this as an agenda for government. But I just wonder if, following Robert's comment, the title of this seminar isn't mistaken, because we should be talking about refreshing Attlee, because the Attlee settlement, it seems to me, was quite different from what Beveridge wanted, and Attlee did try and secure what Helen mentioned, namely a national minimum. The trouble was the minimum was below subsistence rates, so that we had to rely much more than Beveridge would have wanted on means-tested benefits, and Beveridge believed in insurance and means-tested benefits. So we haven't really applied Beveridge properly at all. But the other point I want to make is this: that another weakness of the Attlee settlement was it tended to protect jobs rather than people, and the benefit system kept people in the jobs they were in, which was a huge hindrance to economic change. By contrast with the welfare systems on the continent, which were much more based on insurance. Now, we face this problem in spades today because the idea of a job for life is disappearing. Most people will be changing jobs many times in their lives. And I want to ask the question of whether our welfare system needs to be refashioned to take account of the ideas of lifelong learning and changing jobs, which is the economy we're moving into. And there possibly Beveridge does have something to say, with a system based on insurance and contributions, which he said was a mark of citizenship.
Brilliant. Well, over to the panel to respond if they want to, or Helen, if you want to pick up on Guy's point as well.
I mean, probably both, really. So yes, I absolutely agree. We need to reshape the welfare state with the idea of current jobs are going to be disappearing at pace. People need to be able to reskill and move career paths, and currently the system doesn't help you do that very well. And that is partly about risk. So one of the things we need to do is say, how do you de-risk changing jobs? And that actually brings us back, I think, to some of Guy's points, because two of the big risks in changing job are if the new one doesn't work out, whether because of the job or something like the two buses you have to get there, it turns out one of them is late so often that you can't get there on time. So having a welfare system which makes it feel okay for people who can't build up savings and so on to take a risk, I think is really important, and we've lost that. But also that flexibility point, I mean, coming right back to the role of employers. One of the things I think happened with the employment services side of the Beveridge settlement is that it has actually become too dominated now by state providers. So you've got the kind of this move in recent years-ish to try to put everything through job centres and work coaches. And actually for lots of today's problems, that quite industrial solution really doesn't work. The two things we need to do is properly work with employers to redesign jobs. And that's so Timewise Foundation and others have done great work here, that you need to work with employers to redesign jobs so that they are advertised flexibly. So recent research suggests there's about 600,000 people looking for part-time jobs. There's about 150,000 jobs advertised part-time, mostly low paid. That's a massive problem in the labour market. But actually, more work coach interviews, I don't think is going to particularly help crack the flexibility or progression problems. So I think work with employers should be what the state is doing much more of, but actually working through charities and local organisations, because that kind of how do you help people change track and reskill? It's about relationships, and community organisations are much better than that, frankly, than most job centres are, with the best will in the world. And I think we need to reorient to those approaches to meet both what Vernon was saying and Guy's goals for the system.
Yeah, just on the contributory point, I think at the moment we've got quite a sort of deceitful system, because we do have national insurance, which is the most confusingly named tax you can possibly imagine. And I think that really does breed resentment among people, because people get to a certain age and think, oh, I paid in. They think they've got a pot of money with their name on it. And they don't. It is just a pretty bog standard tax.
Yeah, I was going to say, apart from like rent control doesn't work. I think that if there's one thing that literally every single policy wonk in Westminster, from the furthest left to the furthest right, would agree on, it's like, it's not national insurance. Let's just call it income tax.
Call it something else. Roll it in, get rid of it, because I genuinely think that is one of the obstacles we have to having a sensible debate on welfare in this country, and it starts with a very silly name.
I just wanted to make one really quick point. I think Guy's points about working with employees is really sensible. The challenge is that you don't turn to a US system where your healthcare is tied to employer, which kind of makes it even harder to change jobs. I think you just have to make sure you get that balance right.
So there's quite a lot for me to answer there. Shall I have a go at answering a couple of the points? So the first is on lifelong learning. I couldn't agree with Vernon more. I think it is absolutely key that we have a change of approach in terms of lifelong learning, which traditionally has been something that is anathema to this country. The Auger report, for those of you who haven't read it, I genuinely believe is the way ahead. And I'll give you one stat from the Aviva report on midlife MOT, where they found that 25% of their employees above the age of 50 were about to retire. And by the way, 25% of their employees were over 50. And they had something in the region of 20, 30 years experience. Everyone who did the midlife MOT at Aviva stayed in their job. Most of them then retrained to do other types of work, because they realized at the age of 64, 65, they wouldn't want to do the job that they're presently doing. And most of them then also had the health work they needed, and also had the retirement assessment that they needed to realize that retiring at, say, 57, 58, 59, whatever, wouldn't give them the lifestyle that they wanted to, give them their longevity as it was expected. So there is huge amounts of work to be done on that. I take Helen's point, which it is very hard to do the bridge between job A that I presently hold, but I want to move from, to job B, which is the long-term job that I wish to do, but it is more complicated for me to get from A to B and continue paying my mortgage, my commitments, etc., etc. That is an ability, though, that particularly big companies are beginning to address. I give you one stat that blew me away. So I went to on a ministerial visit, virtually week 2 of my new job. I've only been doing the job 47 days. And I went to a large London hotel with nearly 1,000 beds. The manager of the hotel, fascinating bloke, said to me, traditionally, all my employees 3 years ago were on 9 to 5, or they were on 9 till 6. The usual, basically, on a normal hotel, fixed term contracts, standard stuff. Every single employee now is on flexible work. Every single one. There is no 9 to 5 anymore. And the really key thing for the employer, this is the blew me away bit, is he's gone from 120 staff to 220 staff, but his churn, the numbers of people who are leaving him, and with all the complications on security and accreditation, has gone through the floor. So his staff retention is way, way better. Staff satisfaction is way higher. He has got a much happier workforce, and he looks at hotels across the river who cannot get staff because they are still working on a 9 to 5 fixed term basis. And whereas he has got people who are mums in particular coming in at 9:45, leaving at 2:45, self-evidently going to do these things. Interestingly, I take the point that the job centres aren't necessarily the way ahead on everything. But that was done with the work between 3 local job centres in London, Brixton, Wandsworth, and I forget the other one, Lambeth, I believe, and also with local community organisations. And yes, it has traditionally been the case that you go into a job centre, that's the way ahead. We are trying so hard to widen that base. It is something I am passionate about doing and ensuring we actually have a much more community-based approach. Traditionally, you would never have employers in job centres. You now have them all the time.
Brilliant. Well, we've only got 15 minutes left and lots of people want to say things. So I'm going to try and get to sort of group two questions into two chunks. So one question that's come up in different forms is about disability. Someone saying, Gail Ward saying, do you think the payment levels currently are realistic? Minimum income for disabled claimants, given they face increased costs in the current economic climate. Jamie Thunder pointing out that 80% of the appeals for the personal independence payment are currently lost by the DWP. So, and separately from that, I would add in just that the last 2 years have seen an enormous increase in the number of people who are disabled, and primarily increasingly for mental conditions rather than physical conditions. And to the extent that quite a lot of people think like if this needs to be the next stage of welfare reform. And then referring back to the report Jonathan did with us, one of the sort of findings was people thought we could not be too tough on people who could work but weren't working, but we could not be too generous to people who couldn't work through no fault of their own. Like those were seen as the two ways in which the current system was failing. So on this, a whole slew of things there around disability. But any thoughts very welcome on whether we're getting it right, whether that is the next issue. And I suppose, Helen, this ties into your point about trying to make it easier for people to work with health conditions as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think actually one of the big problems is that thinking that we've got two groups, the can't work and the can work, because it's just fundamentally we haven't. We have some people who can definitely work full time all the time, and we have some people who can't work at all. We've got many more people who can work and want to work, but not necessarily full time, not in every job, and only if they get the right services. And we're not very good at any of those things, essentially. I think what Guy was saying earlier about employers doing a lot more, being helped to do a lot more to stop people falling out of jobs. We aren't very good at that. We aren't very good at our sick pay and all those things. But also, when I looked at this for the book, I think it's staggering that half of people in poverty are either disabled or live with someone who is. It is just an enormous problem. And if you look at some of the data that's been coming through, the level of food insecurity, the level of just incredibly deep hardship for disabled people and carers, it's one of the genuinely shocking things about the stats we've seen this year and in previous years. But I think that when I reflected on how we've addressed this, it feels like we have done an enormous amount to pressure disabled people to do more, essentially, in different ways and to cut benefits. We've done remarkably little to get employers to change things, to make things easier for people. We've done remarkably little to tackle really pretty high levels of discrimination and prejudice against disabled people across society. And I think that needs rebalancing to actually crack this.
Jonathan, anything? I mean, this is obviously an area you've looked at quite.
I think it's difficult. I agree pretty much everything Helen just said. I think carers in particular, the current system is incredibly ungenerous and has really bad incentives for people who try to combine caring with working. But it is tricky because the Treasury always gets very sceptical about room for people to play the system. And to some extent, it comes back to just the management point. It's just coming up with better systems that can be more nuanced and more careful in doing these things. But I don't think there's an easy answer on this one, to be honest. But
shall I try and come in and address a few of those points? So there's a number of different issues. I mean, clearly the government has raised the welfare support by 10.1% in very difficult times and focused on the most vulnerable. Everybody knows about the energy support packages worth well over £1,000 over the last 9 months, plus the disability support of 150, plus the council tax support of 150. I could go on. So I think there is, in the short term, there has been as much as the government could possibly do in this particular space. The second bit would be disability employment. I would push back slightly on Helen's point there, because the stats on disability employment, post-disability confidence and everything like that, are overwhelming, that there are so many more companies who are now willing and able to address their employment needs by employing someone with a disability. Now, it may be that there more needs to be done. I have no doubt whatsoever. I'm not the disability minister, but I have to say that the stats are overwhelming that there is a greater amount of disability employment. The one bit that I would then say is, which is for a discussion on a think tank, is surely this, which is, yes, we have nearly 9 million people who are termed economically inactive, of which that can be subdivided by well over 2 million students, well over 1 million people who are caring. I take Jonathan's point that there is a serious issue in terms of incentives for those who are caring to then go into work and or to how they work and the balance between that. But that's very much what Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has asked the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to look at. All the cohorts of economic inactivity, which include over 2 million sick and disabled people, what is it that we can do to assist them if they wish to work? What are the incentives that we can then create? How do we manage that system better so that it is fairer for everybody? Now, that is a work in progress on economic inactivity. Clearly, there is a separate cohort of economically active population, and I have the joy of trying to fill nearly 1.2 million vacancies in this country. Now, in all those areas, we are trying to address different things, but very much on economic inactivity and those individual cohorts, that's a work in progress.
Thanks. Duncan, did you want to come in, or you okay? Perfect. Okay. Well, so for the last topic, I mean, it sort of comes back to the NHS, which a couple of people have talked about. Essentially, is how do we move to prevention rather than cure? I mean, John Bullard in the comment is saying, you know, should we call it should it be the National Sickness Service or the National Wellness Service? So other people saying, how do we focus more on the prevention of poor health? I mean, you know, Duncan, you've talked about investing in sort of investing upstream. Guy, you talked about getting employers involved. I mean, one element that we haven't touched on, of course, is early years and childcare benefits, and the fact that and the fact that all that basically there are actually, for all this, when you talk about millions, there are actually quite a small number of people whose families and whose lives are profoundly broken, who then not only have disproportionately awful outcomes, but incur a disproportionate cost to the state. So if we appointed you to this new commission for the fixing the NHS and British society commission, what would be your sort of initial thoughts? Duncan, you didn't get a chance to talk last time, so.
Just echo what I said before. I would just try not to focus on the NHS, because it is just the problems are elsewhere. In the state, if you have fantastic schools, you will have healthier children. If you have well-funded local authorities, they'll be able to offer better services and help troubled families who do maybe create more problems in the system than other ones. If you have slightly more generous child benefit, it will just lift more people out of poverty. Like, you do just need to focus more on upstreams and just don't forget about the health. Although the health service, one thing I do find interesting is that there is a bit of a sort of a omerta among British politicians when it comes to discussing one particular problem when it comes to British health, and that we are quite a fat nation. And so there does need to be a much bigger push on that, because that does seem to be the big secret that no one's sort of really willing to talk about in British politics, because nobody's going to look voters in the eye and call.
Well, we talked about it for about 5 minutes when Boris almost died of COVID and decided that we needed calorie counts on menus. And then he started eating cheese again, as far as I understand it.
That therein is the problem right there. We need to collectively get off the cheese and chorizo.
Jonathan, you've unmuted. So.
Yeah, small rebate. How would you sort the NHS side? So I think actually it was a bit of a shame that we backed away from the separate health and social care levy, not necessarily in the sense of putting taxes up, but I think a bit more transparency in terms of the amount of the budget that is going towards the NHS would not be a terrible place to start. And I think I'm probably slightly more pessimistic about the potential prevention as compared to the need for a kind of more classic supplier competition transparency about what's going on. I do think maybe some more patient discretion and transparency. So, this is going back, if we are talking about supply side, I think it's still slightly a scandal how we've all been talking about digitalizing the NHS for 20 years and I'm sure Matt Hancock promised me a digital health record 5 years ago, and I still have yet to get it. Which I think actually a patient that. So I'm actually a type 1 diabetic. So I deal quite a lot with the NHS in a day-to-day business, and dealing just with the bureaucracy of, I'm normally the person who has to chase the consultant, the hospital and GP, and bring everything together. And no, you haven't prescribed this that you promised you 6 months ago. And just, I think getting patients more involved and a less of a doctor knows best attitude actually could quite help in putting some upwards pressure in the system.
I do absolutely agree about the technology point. So I've also got long-term health conditions, spent lots of time in hospitals, and kind of watching my consultants still use a dictaphone to say the letter which their secretary will now have to write to come out to me, and talking to them about the lack of technology they've got access to is just ridiculous. You know, even before you get to the higher level stuff around AI diagnostics and so on, which could be really transformative. I would say on prevention, I think there's some really interesting stuff that Hilary Cottam and others have done around the country of local experiments around how you really break the model of the kind of very, again, industrial process-based, one family has to deal with 20 different services, all of whom have different forms to fill in, and actually bringing it to be about relationships and peer support and listening to people about what they need, not just fitting them into your boxes. I think it does really seem to work, but it's hard to scale, and we need to find a way to get that to happen across the country.
So I'll try and dive in and assist on this. So I'm utterly agree with Duncan about the issue of obesity. And I hope that we have a rational, grown-up, serious and sensible story that is presented in British politics, which is not nanny state exists in circumstances where the state knows that it is paying for huge amounts of consequences of obesity, and that a much more rational and sensible discussion goes forward. I think that's going to happen over a period of time. I don't think it can happen straight away. Clearly, there is complications over the last 6 months and the various back and forth on that. But the evidence, in my view, is overwhelming. That does require, though, the state to act and to take decisions in circumstances where not everybody would agree that that is a conservative thing to do, where you have total free choice. I'm certainly on the side of Boris post his COVID incident and his views at that particular stage. I won't go any further on that because it's most definitely not government policy. The blunt one is this one, though, which is if you wish to improve outcomes, you have to have better data and better data sharing. And I think that the progress of the online harms bill, which is a whole separate issue of debate and discussion, is complicated, but the post-COVID, I hope there is now an acceptance that the sharing of data is a good thing, where it can show that you're going to get health benefits and better outcomes. Because traditionally our sharing of data has been very poor, with consequences that we don't have the ability for the various arms of the state, whether it's the health service or others, to know enough about you to do the interventions it needs to do. And I think that is the big step forward, which is relatively low cost, but requires a change in policy on a long-term basis. I'll stop there because I'm conscious of time.
Brilliant. Well, no, that's really good. Unfortunately, we've run out of time just before I could ask the most properly right-wing question I've had, which is, are we giving too much in benefits to people who are not by any definition poor? But if anyone wants to do a one-word answer to that.
Old people, yes, but there you go.
That's what I was going for. But no, I think we can save that for the sequel. Thank you all for a really fascinating discussion. Just to reiterate, Guy Opperman, Minister for Work and Pensions, Duncan Robinson, budget columnist on The Economist, Helen Barnard, Research and Policy Director at Pro Economics and author of Want, from a new series on the fire giants, and Jonathan Dupont, who I don't think I specified at the start, is not only a CPS contributor, but they partner at Public First, which is a very good consultancy. So thank you all of them. Thank you all of you. I don't think we're having any more of these events before Christmas, so I hope you have a very happy Christmas and New Year, and hope to see you again at more CPS events in future. Cheers.